method, only because I find it to be a little bit more stable. So what I mean by that is with the traditional French meringue, what you would do is you would whip up part of your egg whites in with your sugar in your mixer, or you could use a hand mixer until you have a soft peak, and then you fold it into your icing sugar and almond mixture. That one, you would mix it just to a point where your mix looks like slow moving lava. Okay, you want to try not to overmix, because then you're not going to get the rise in your macaroons. With the Italian meringue version, what you would do is you would boil sugar onto the stove with a little bit of water, and then it's going to reach like a soft ball to a hard ball stage if you have a candy thermometer. And then you would pour that into your whipped egg whites, and then you would fold that into your almond sugar mix. The thing that I like about the Italian meringue version is that you can pipe your macaroons on your tray. You don't have to let them sit like you would with a French style. I usually just let mine sit, and then I take my my baking tray and I tap about 4 or 5 times on my countertop, just to release any air bubbles that might be in there. And then if you do have some air bubbles on top of your shells, then you can just take a small pin and actually just pop them. And then they just go into the oven at 350 degrees and put them in for about 8 minutes. And the important thing too is just let them cool on the tray. It's better to have your macaroons overbaked than under, because if they're even just a slight underbaked, then you'll actually have them cave in. I hope that answers some of your question.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chef Laura. If there's any follow-up questions to making macaroons, by all means, like I said, you can just ask away in the Q&A session, or just ask us to raise your hand, and then we'll unmute your microphone. Are you a big fan of macaroons, Chef Laura, yourself?
I do like them. I wouldn't say they're my favorite go-to, but I do enjoy eating them, especially with chocolate ganache.
Delicious. My sister-in-law actually recently just made her first attempt at making macaroons. I don't know if it was good or not, but it was definitely very coconutty, and I enjoyed it. So is coconut a big topping for macaroons?
Well, there's actually 2 kinds of macaroons. That's a really good point to bring up. So there's a coconut macaroon, and then there's a traditional, I guess it could be macaroon or macaron, depending on who's saying. So actually, they're 2 very different things. So the macaroon that I was speaking of is made with almonds, so they're naturally gluten-free, and then they have like a nice smooth top dome, and then they have a little border around the bottom, which is called the foot. So to have a nice French macaroon, then you would have the foot at the bottom, and then you sandwich the 2 halves together. With a coconut macaroon, that one is made more with shredded coconut. Usually there's a condensed milk, and then you bake them in the oven in kind of what would be like a haystack.
Right. Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. And again, for those of us who are joining us as we're presenting, if you have any questions, use the Q&A section to ask away, or if you'd like to ask directly to Chef Laura, just go ahead and raise your hand. We have a question actually, and the question is, with many health issues related to too much sugar, how much sugar can you cut back in some recipes? Is it by half? And what happens when chemical substitutes are not an option?
I think it just depends actually on what you're making. If you are making something like, just say a chocolate chip cookie, sugar actually is an ingredient that will control the spread of your cookie on your baking sheet. So usually you'll find, like when you use a white sugar, you have more crispiness, and when you use a brown sugar, it's hygroscopic. So it actually leans to be more of a moisture cookie. It draws moisture from the atmosphere. I wouldn't play too much with the sugar in cookies. I mean, you could take a few tablespoons out. But if you're making something, just say with like a banana bread or a loaf, then absolutely cut the sugar. I always cut it by at least half, especially if you're using bananas, or you can even use applesauce in place of some of the fat, and then you can reduce the sugar a little bit further. But with cakes, I would say no. I'm not too familiar with working with other sweeteners like a chemical sweetener, so I'm not really. I don't know how those would react.
Are there natural sweeteners that you can put or add to your what you would otherwise use traditional like white sugar for?
Yep, you can substitute with a little bit of honey, or if you're vegan, you can substitute with a little bit of maple syrup. Just be careful if there is liquid in your recipe, because you may need to adjust that amount. There are some sugars out there on the market that actually, it's a very long name and I can't remember. It actually helps to, it doesn't quite spike your blood sugar levels. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name. I know it starts with an E, but it's about 13 characters long.
Right, right. And we can certainly pass that information on to you guys once we are able to identify that. But you know, it's really interesting when thinking about, you know, chemicals, sugars, and I know a lot of people might not necessarily like the substitutes like aspartame and all that other kind of substitutes. But we have another question or a comment actually, and this is from Fatima, and she's saying when I use, she's used applesauce instead of oil for muffins and cupcakes from sticking to paper. Chef Laura, any feedback regarding that?
Yeah, I actually use applesauce quite a bit in my recipes as well. So not only can I cut back the sugar, but the applesauce also provides fiber. Are you talking about maybe your cupcakes sticking to your liners? Was that the question, Nabil?
I think it was just a suggestion to use an alternative instead of using, I guess, oil or butter. You can use applesauce so that it doesn't stick to the pan per se.
Mm-hmm. I still always will put parchment paper on the bottoms of my pans when I'm baking. I find that it makes for an easy cleanup, and then it's also easier to, nothing gets stuck on the bottom of the pan.
Perfect. Good, great conversations. I just want to make people aware that this is being recorded, but nobody's webcam is on. So if anybody has any issues, just let me know. But this is being recorded. So thank you, Chef Laura, for answering those questions. Let's move on to another question that we have received, and that is, why do my eggs need to be at room temperature when I bake?
Okay, so that's a really great question. The eggs should be at room temperature because if you've ever mixed a cake batter and you've creamed your butter and your sugar and it looks lovely, and then you add cold eggs and then you mix, and then your mixture starts to curdle. So that's because your eggs are cold and it's kneading cold. So it's going to curdle your mix. Doesn't mean that you can't use it. It's just not pleasing to the eye. So when you have room temperature eggs, it actually incorporates into your mixture a lot better, especially if you are making a cake per se, and the recipe calls for room temperature eggs. It can actually increase your baking time if you use a colder egg.
I did not know that.
Mm-hmm.
I've always been baking with cold eggs.
Well, if you didn't take them out of the fridge, that's okay. You can actually just put them in a glass with warm water for about 5 minutes, and then you're set. And they also separate better too if you're using a room temperature egg.
Interesting. You learn something new every day. So, Chef Laura, we got another question for you.
Mm-hmm.
And it is, I have a pie crust recipe that measures flour by weight. So for example, 600 grams. I don't have a scale. How do I convert this to cups? And is there a best practice that you would suggest?
I tend to use a digital scale for most of my baking at home. I find it a little bit more efficient and faster, but I understand a lot of recipes are in cups and teaspoons. My suggestion would just to be go onto a conversion site where they are specifically measuring grams of flour into cups of flour.
Great, thank you for that. I hope that answered the question. Again, if there's any follow-ups, just please feel free to type in the Q&A box. Another question for you, Chef. What are the different types of yeast that we can use in baking, and is there ones that you would recommend, or does it matter based on what it is that you're making?
Okay, so there's quite a few different. Well, there's a main kind of yeast, and it has different variations. Since everyone's on the bread bandwagon, I think it's amazing that people are experimenting. So there's a number of yeast. So there's an instant yeast, there's a rapid rise yeast, which is also known as a bread machine yeast. And then there is fresh yeast, which is also called compressed or cake yeast. So the one that you see at the grocery store, like the Fleshman 3-pack, that is an instant yeast. So basically what it is, it's yeast that has been ground into granules and had about 1/3 of the moisture taken out of it. So it has a little bit more of a shelf life to it. And then that one you would, well, traditionally you would add that one to a little bit of warm water, not hot, because it still is a live organism. And the hot water will kill the yeast. And then you would let it sit for about 5 minutes. If you are going to be making bread per se, what I do is I will put a little bit of honey actually in with my yeast and mix it with the water. And then you will see an explosion of like yeasty foam, which is what you're looking for. And then the only trick to that is that you do not want to put salt in there at the same time, because salt is hygroscopic. So what it will do, it will actually pull the moisture out from the yeast, and it will kill the yeast. For the bread machine yeast, you can buy the one that's labeled bread machine or the rapid rise yeast, but really they're kind of the same thing. The only difference between that one is that it's actually again a smaller granule, and what happens, it will incorporate into your dough faster than a larger granule. My favorite to use actually is the compressed fresh yeast. It's a little bit difficult to find. I know that you can find it at some specialty grocery stores. I like it because it comes in like a little cake, and then you just break off what you need, and you can either mix it in. It's called a yeast slurry, which is where you mix the water and your yeast in preparation for your other ingredients, or you can just add it right in. I like that one because I feel it gives the best flavor. It hasn't been manipulated in any way. It's in its original form. The only drawback to that one is that you have to use it within a week's time, because it will mold and you'll have to throw it out. But if I had to pick a yeast, I like the cake yeast or the compressed yeast.
Fantastic, thanks, Chef Laura. So many different types of yeast. I had no idea. And just a follow-up question to that from our participants is, do you stir the yeast into the water or just sprinkle it? And it never seems to activate within 5 to 10 minutes for this participant.
So yeast does expire, so it's always really important to check the expiry date. And then also, I know exactly what you mean, that I used to find that when I used to have the yeast in the water, just make sure when you're testing your water, just test on the inside of your wrist. You just want it to be lukewarm. And then I usually stir mine just so it's a little bit incorporated. But I found that sometimes it wouldn't plume as much as it does when I add the honey. So give it a try and let me know how it goes.
Awesome. And again, guys, if you have any questions or any comments, just put it in the Q&A section below. Another question for you, Chef, is why is it so important to measure everything when baking?
Baking is definitely a science. So, for example, if you are guessing your salt weight, that can damage whatever you're making if you put in too much. But then you need to put in enough so that it will react with different ingredients so that it will create a rise or like a different kind of texture. So it's really, really important to measure accurately, especially with your leavening agents. Even with flour, when you do a dip and sweep method, so what you're going to want to do when your flour is compressed in the bag, if you want to use a whisk or a spoon, then you would just aerate your flour, and then you could dip in your cup and then sweep the top so that you actually get an accurate amount. With flour especially, because if you're making a cake, it will create a more heavier sponge because you're adding in too much flour. But definitely a science for sure.
Right. So when it comes to baking, I guess spontaneity or creativity might not be the name of the game. Not always, at least maybe a little bit of prep work before going into.
Yeah, you can still play around a little bit, but not as much as when you're cooking.
Right, right. Again, guys, if you have any questions or comments on that, just please feel free to write on the question box below. Another question, Chef. What is your favorite savory baking recipe?
That's hard. You know what actually I really love making are Gruyere and fresh herb pâte à choux. So it's kind of like a profiterole or a cream puff, if you will. But instead of having a sweet filling, I actually make the paste with a little bit of cheese and fresh herbs. And then I bake them, and then I can cut them in half, and then I can fill them. So that would have to be my favorite.
And when are you making that for us?
Maybe the next time I'm here.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, we have another question. What is the secret to good pastry?
Sorry, say again.
What is the secret to making a good pastry?
Oh, like a pie dough? Okay, well, that one is you want to make sure that you've properly measured your flour, that you use cold butter, and you use ice cold water. So that one, when you've got your flour and you're cutting in your butter, you want your flour mix to resemble small peas. And then you'll add your water in and just mix. You don't want to add too much water because then it'll create a tough dough. So then you just want to mix your pie dough until it looks shaggy. And then you take it out, and then you can put it in pieces of saran wrap or beeswax wrap or whatever you use at home, and then you chill it.
Awesome.
But not too much water, because it gets it's easier to roll when there's lots of water, but the taste is definitely not flaky.
Got it, Chef. Got it. I'm gonna make perfect pastry moving forward. So we have a couple questions. So the next question is, are muffin and loaf recipes interchangeable? They seem very similar, and I know the baking time would change, but do you have to change anything else?
No, I would just go for it. That's a great question. There's sometimes when I bake banana bread and I make mini loaves for the kids, and then I'll sometimes have extra batter and I just put them right into my muffin liners.
So do you prefer muffins over loaves, or loaves over muffins?
It depends. If I'm making a carrot loaf, then I prefer mini loaves and cupcakes, or not cupcakes because it doesn't have icing, but and like muffins. But I find the muffins are a little bit easier to freeze and take out smaller amounts.
Right, right. I'm a muffin man. I love it. So we have another question from our good friend Ken, and they are asking, recipes call for wine without identifying what type, whether it's dry or sweet. Is there some publication that says what wine cooks best with what type of food? Not in terms of pairing, but just in terms of putting the ingredient.
I guess it just depends on on what you're making. If you're making something with beef, then usually you would turn to a sherry or a dry red wine. If you're cooking with chocolate, they suggest even like a Cabernet Franc is quite nice, or an ice wine. If you're cooking with chicken, they say it's more white, but I'm not sure. I guess the thing about that too is even with the pairing, it's actually you're more pairing with the sauce that's with whatever you're cooking than with the actual main ingredient, if that makes sense.
Awesome, thanks. Thank you for that. Again, guys, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Chef, I got a question for you. I've always noticed that there's different types of like flour, and I'm not a, baking aficionado by any means, but I've seen there's like white flour, there's salmonella, is it salmonella? I can't remember how you say it, but there's different types of flour.
We don't want to.
You don't want salmonella, but there's different types of flours or cooking ingredients for baking. Like, what do all those things refer to? And is there something that we can use for certain things over other types of flour?
I think, yes, yeah, that's a great question, especially now that they have so many flour alternatives. I'm not too familiar with working with gluten-free, but I do usually at home, I'll use all-purpose for most of my things. So they all have different protein contents. So you have a pastry and cake flour that has a protein content about 7 to 9%. And that just means that it doesn't make as much gluten when you add a liquid. All-purpose flour tends to be around 10 to 12%, which means it's moderate, like right in the middle. Bread flour is 10 to 12%. No, sorry, I'm thinking of all-purpose still. Bread flour tends to go about 12 to 14%, and that one has really high gluten structure when you add water, so that you can create like a mesh, like kind of like a window if you're going to be making a bread. But bread flour, you know what, you can use that for chocolate chip cookies too. You just have to, it depends on what kind of texture you're looking for in your final product. When you go to whole wheat flour, that's about 16%, and that one, you have to be careful because you might need to incorporate a little bit more liquid into your mixture, because it does have the whole endosperm and the germ that will absorb more water. If you have a recipe that calls for cake and pastry flour and you're like, I don't have any, that's okay, because all you do is you take, for 1 cup of all-purpose flour, you take out 2 tablespoons of the flour and replace it with cornstarch, and then you sift it a few times, and then you've got your cake and pastry flour.
Awesome, thank you. The variety of flours, I think I was referring to semolina, not
Oh, semolina is more for when you're making pasta.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a really fine ground flour.
Awesome. There we go. Now I will never mix up salmonella and semolina again. A couple more questions. We have for you, do you use golden brown or dark brown sugar?
I prefer golden brown. I just find the taste is a little bit more mellow. And I find sometimes when I use a dark brown sugar, it really does add a lot of color to your finished product. And it definitely has a little bit more of the molasses taste that is still on the sugar crystal. But yeah, I tend to go with the golden, but both are fine.
Golden brown sugar it is. Another question from our good friend Fatima. They're asking,
I love your questions. You're doing great.
yes. What is the purpose of meringue powder in buttercream? It crusts their icing. Is it a preservative?
Most people will use meringue powder. It's a little bit more safe, I would say, than using an egg white, especially if you're going to be having it out for long periods of time. It's a little bit more stable. I do find meringue powder does crust. They use a lot of meringue powder in royal icing, and that one obviously crusts, but I don't normally use it in my icings per se. I use fresh egg whites. But I do find the meringue powder, it probably does act as a little bit of a preservative, but I'm not really 100% sure on that one.
Which one would you use? Would you use like egg whites or?
I use egg whites.
Awesome.
But I do use meringue powder for royal icing.
Cool. Awesome. Good stuff. We have another question for you, Chef. So we talked about your favorite savory baking recipe. What's your favorite sweet baking recipe?
I guess it depends on the time of year, because right now I'm leaning towards pumpkin pie. You know what? I really am still a sucker for apple pie. It's probably my most favorite.
It's hard to blame you for that choice, Chef. We have Fatima actually, and she would like to ask a question live. So Fatima, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. So feel free to ask away.
Hi there. Thank you for the session.
Hi. Thanks so much for your great questions.
I do a lot of cupcakes and also, like, cakes for birthdays and things like that. So for, again, the buttercream, like I took the Wilton courses when they had them at Michael's. So that buttercream icing, you can use like water or you can use milk. And then I know some people use whipping cream. So I use water when I think it's going to be out at room temperature for a long time, but I know milk and whipping cream taste better in icing. But then I'm always afraid, like if I use whipping cream, that the icing will go bad. So do I have to do something, or is it just a fear and it won't go bad like after a couple of days, or?
Oh, a couple of days should be totally fine.
Okay, should it, like that icing, should it always be put in the fridge if you're using whipping cream or milk to make your buttercream?
It's actually, I'm not sure of the Wilton recipe. I've never used it. But when I make my icing, so I'll either make an Italian buttercream or a Swiss meringue buttercream. And I just let mine sit out on the counter. I have it out on my counter for a few days.
Okay, this recipe, it's butter, water, milk, or whipping cream, and your icing sugar and a pinch of salt. And usually it calls for meringue powder too, but meringue powder gives it a different flavor, I find also.
Yes, it does. I totally know what you're saying. So that's more like an American buttercream. And that's totally fine to sit out on your counter, even if you add cream. I would suggest using 35% because a lot of the water has been taken out of the cream. And I find it just gives it a way better like taste on your tongue.
Tastes better. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Have you ever, sorry.
Oh, sorry, you can finish.
Oh, I was going to say, have you ever tried to do a Swiss meringue buttercream?
No, I think there's one where you boil egg whites or something. Once I tried this 7-minute frosting, but it didn't work out. I don't know Swiss meringue. I've never tried the other ones.
Yeah, the Swiss meringue is it's really great for well, you're not a beginner, but for a starting point where you actually warm up your sugar and your egg whites in a double boiler.
Okay.
Yeah, you should give it a try. I think that you'll really like it. And I find with the Swiss meringue and the Italian meringue buttercreams that you get a really nice smooth side when you're icing a cake. Okay. And it's a little bit easier to pipe.
Okay, maybe I'll try it. I may have tried something similar before when I was a beginner, and I think water, I don't have a double broiler, so I like maybe have a pot on a pot and if
That's
steam
totally
gets
what I
in
do.
it,
Yep.
yeah. But if steam touches it, I think it ruins it, right?
That would be the case with chocolate. But if you just have a pot on your stove, like a saucepan,
Yeah.
and then you have a stainless steel bowl on top of that, if you just bring it to a simmer, then you should be fine. And then you're just constantly whisking the egg whites and the sugar on the stove. Basically, what you're doing there is you are warming up your egg whites and you're helping to dissolve your sugar crystals.
Okay, okay. I have two other questions, if I can ask.
If you don't mind, I can just put you on quick. You can totally come back to the question, Fatima, if that is okay.
Yeah.
But I would just like, we have our good friend Carrie asking to Chef Laura, if you would share a recipe for Swiss meringue buttercream.
I think that we could totally post that on the site.
Yeah,
I would love to do.
we have the people
Yeah,
who
that
have
would be great.
registered, we have their contact information. So maybe that's we can do that as a next step and share that information. So Carrie, we will be sharing Chef Laura's favorite Swiss meringue buttercream. And on that point, or on that note, Chef, Wanda is asking, what can you do for a recipe that calls for buttermilk and you don't have any?
Oh, that's a really easy fix, actually. So if it calls for, just say, a half a cup of buttermilk, you measure out your milk in a liquid measure, and then you add about a tablespoon of white vinegar or lemon juice, and you let it sit for 5 minutes, and then you're ready to go.
Easy fixes. That's why we need you, Chef, to be able to share with us these wonderful tips. Perfect. Awesome. Thanks for asking all those wonderful questions. And so Fatima, you can continue your question. I'm going to quickly unmute you, and you can ask away.
Okay, thank you. My other question is, I use a lot of box mixes actually, so I'm not that great a baker, but whenever I've tried to bake cakes, they come out very like almost like stiff or too dense. They're not moist like a box mix. So are there any tips? Is it maybe a case I put too much flour at that time?
There could be a couple reasons there. It could be that your flour weight might not be what it's calling for. So just try to aerate your flour. Check the expiry dates on your leavening agents. Another thing is just to check your oven temperature. It sounds like maybe it might be too hot. Do you find it caving in a little bit in the oven?
No, I mean, I use baking strips on my pans, and I really love that technique to have a leveled cake.
Yeah.
But this was some time ago where then the cake just tasted stale and too hard.
Do you know that that I find when you are making a cake with just butter, it tends to be really dry. The crumb is very tight in your cake. So sometimes what I'll do is I will add some coconut oil and butter at the same time, like to combine whatever measure it is that you need. Because I find when you have just butter, it tends to be a very dry crumb. But what you can do to combat that is you can make a simple syrup. So it's equal parts of water and equal parts of sugar. You boil it on the stove, cool it, and then you can soak your cake with a pastry brush before putting on your icing.
Yes, so I've heard of that method, but does the syrup, like I always fear like the top of the cake's gonna get too moist and mushy, or I mean, does the syrup really absorb down into the cake?
It does. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Even if you're concerned that it's going to just stay on the top, you can always take a toothpick or a skewer, and you could poke your cake, and then you could put your simple syrup on as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. My last question is just about chocolate, like chocolate candy melts. Do you have any tips for, I've seen like sometimes microwaving or then on the double broiler, and that it doesn't, I think it can get hardened. So what would be your best tips for that? Thank you.
So the candy melts, basically, if you overheat them, then they are not fluid. So I know that they say to put them in the microwave like 10-second intervals, keep stirring, because your bowl will actually really retain a lot of heat as well. I prefer to do mine over a double boiler because then I can have an eye on it all the time while I'm stirring. If you're going to use them for just say a cake pop, what you can do is you can add a little bit of shortening if you have it, or you can use a little bit of sunflower oil, not too much, but just enough to make it more fluid for dipping. They also have something called Paramount crystals that you can buy, and that's what I tend to use. It actually just thins it out a little bit more, so that it's really good for dipping. But with chocolate, if it does come in contact with steam coming up over your bowl, then it will actually seize, and then unfortunately it's not usable.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. And now I know we're getting closer to the conclusion. We have another question, again, from our good friend, Wanda. And the question is, what do you think about the increased interest in baking since the pandemic? And do you think that it's going to continue? And how has the pandemic impacted you, chef? Other than obviously we're doing a virtual program today.
Well, I really do miss the interaction of people in and baking together and having that time. I love that. I am fascinated, and I love the fact that people have been being more rootsy, going back and making breads and making their own baked goods. I think it's amazing, and I think that shows in the lack of flour at the grocery store and the lack of yeast. And I hope that people do continue to develop these skills and pass them on to other family members. Has it impacted me? Yeah, for sure it has. Like it's hard to not be able to find things at the store when you need them, but you know, I'm so thrilled that people are taking it up and having fun.
It is quite fascinating. I remember when the pandemic first happened, or we got, you know, it was March or April, and like you couldn't find, along with toilet paper, like you couldn't find flour to make anything with, right? And so it is interesting. Sometimes just making food yourself, whether that's dessert, baking, whatever, there's something very therapeutic to that, something very calming during a midst of so much uncertainty, right? So.
Absolutely, very comforting. You're in there with your hands. It's tactile. Absolutely.
Perfect. Thanks for sharing. Chef, we got another question from our good friend Carrie. I don't have a double boiler. When putting a metal bowl over a pot, do you have to make sure that the bowl doesn't touch the water?
Good. Yes, very good question. So if you have a pot of water, you maybe want to have maybe an inch and a half of water in the pot, and you just have it on a simmer. Yep. So you don't need any kind of fancy equipment. I definitely don't have that at home.
Fantastic. Another question from Fatima, and they're asking, when is it better to bake with butter or oil, or oil versus butter? Which wins, or which is better?
It depends, I guess, on what you're making. That's a tough question, only because I definitely am a purist, so I really like just to use butter. But again, going back to your cake question, it does make a little bit of a drier sponge. So when I make things like carrot cake, per se, that is already moist because you bought carrots and so many eggs, I do use butter, and I do use a little bit of sunflower oil in that cake recipe, just to bring out the moisture. But yeah, it's kind of, that's a really tricky one. I'm sorry, I don't have a definite answer. I guess it just really depends on what you're making. But I do tend to go just the butter route, but that's my personal choice. But I think if you find you mix a little bit of butter with a little bit of oil, I think that you'll come out with a better product in your cake baking. Also in the cake boxes, the reason why they do have it so much, you are adding oil, but they do have like dough conditioners and things in there that lean towards a fluffy and airy cake.
Amazing. I believe we have another question. Oh, and so Fatima is asking, are you doing any cooking classes, Chef?
I do baking classes and cooking classes through QEP. Unfortunately, right now we're unable to do them, but hopefully in the near future we can. Right now we're just working on we're working on more video and seeing how that goes. But yeah, keep looking in the calendar.
Right, and this is a great plug. You know, Fatima, just to let you know that we recently piloted actually a program called Cooking with Rescued Food, and we're hoping to have that available for all of you guys to view, where we take ingredients that you would find at a local food bank or even at a grocery store and make some wonderful, delicious, healthy meals with it. So keep an eye out for that. We're trying to relaunch that in a couple of weeks, and the program is called Cooking with Rescued Food, and it'll be available on the QEP Facebook page, and we're going to put it on a town website as well. So definitely we have to pivot with obviously what COVID is throwing our way, and the virtual platform definitely seems to be one that is an option given that physical distancing measures are in place. And so we have a question, and maybe we'll take a couple more. And this is from our good friend Maxine. Cinnamon roll, any tips? And for Maxine, they don't rise as much.
So you're using, I'm going to assume that you're using a yeast that has not expired. Just pay attention to the temperature of the liquid that you're putting in with your yeast, because that might also be affecting the rise. So I know traditionally when you make cinnamon buns and you make your dough and it's and then you're rolling it out, and then you're cutting and then putting in your pan. Are you letting it rest long enough where they're proofing to almost double the size?
So Maxine is saying that they use warm milk, but it didn't say what temperature the milk is at.
Okay, so just use lightly warmed milk, because if you heat your milk up too hot, then it actually kills the yeast. So that might be a problem. So just make sure, again, it's just like a little bit lukewarm if you touch a little bit on the inside of your wrist, and you should have a little bit more success.
Perfect. I'm a sucker for cinnamon rolls.
They're good.
I could eat them from breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and I have done that. So with that, if we don't have any more questions, guys, I know, Chef, you brought a couple of cool tools and a roller with you, so maybe you just share with us a little bit of what that is all about before we wrap it up.
Perfect. I did bring some rolling pins from home. I love rolling pins, but I'm just going to quickly show you something with piping bags, especially Fatima, if you're going to be making your macaroons. When I'm making things that are with nuts, I tend to use a disposable bag, and you can buy these at any specialty store or at Michael's or at Bulk Barn. So when you are using a piping bag, what you're going to do is you're going to make a cup in your piping bag, okay? So that this hand never gets dirty, all right? So then you can use a spatula or you can use a scraper. You scrape your mix out and then you can put it into your bag. And then when you've got your bag half full, okay, not more than half full, because then you're putting a lot of pressure on your hands. Then this comes up, okay? So your hands don't get dirty, because there's nothing worse than explosion out of the top of your piping bag. And then if you create an L, then you just cinch your piping bag like so, and then you can push down so your mix is in the bottom of the piping bag, okay? And then at this point, you're gonna wrap the bag around your thumb, and then you're gonna twist here. And then you can have ultimate control over your piping bag. And that's how you would do that, okay? It's a little trick about your piping bags. And then you can also buy fabric ones that you can wash. I have a ton of these. Okay, so my love for rolling pins. So there's a couple different kinds of rolling pins. So you've got your traditional American style rolling pin. This one was passed down to me, and I'm so in love with it. I'll show you this one. These are both the same. So both traditional American style rolling pins. I brought this one because this one has, you can see on the ends, it actually has a screw and a spring that goes through your rolling pin. So this one, you can hold the handles and then you have the flexibility for rolling. So my dad actually made this one for me, and it's made out of a piece of cherry wood. And then he's seasoned it, so it actually doesn't stick to the dough that much when I'm rolling. But this one's great because you can roll even pressure. The only thing about this one is that it's not very good for things like yeasted doughs, okay? So if you're gonna do a yeasted dough, you could have something like this. And so this is actually called a French tapered pin. I will admit, this is my most favorite. This one is great because you can apply pressure on your dough with the palms of your hands. So you can really get in there and push your dough with the rolling pin. Something similar to that one is also a French pin. And then this one is not tapered. It's just kind of like an American rolling pin without the handles. This one I really love, especially if I'm rolling out, say, fondant, because I can put even pressure on my rolling pin with the palms of my hands. Okay. This one I find, if you're rolling, just say fondant, you're really putting a lot of pressure on your fingers and you're really rolling that way. I know at some specialty stores, I don't know if you guys have seen this, but this is a kind of a unique rolling pin where it has measurements on the side so you can see actually how big you're rolling. This one's great for cookie dough, and I'll show you why. So this actually comes off on both ends. And then if you're kind of not comfortable with how your cookies thickness will be the same for your whole mass, they have these little circles that you can take on and off, and that will help control how thick your cookie will be. So I'll show you what I mean. So then this just goes on like this, and then you do obviously the same color on the other end. So if you're not comfortable with your thickness of rolling, like if one half is thick and the other half is really thin, then this is also a really great alternative because you can still roll, but it will only ever be as thick as the top of the marker. But practice rolling, you know what, it gets better with practice. So you don't have one side that's too thick and one side that's too thin, but it's all practice.
Those are phenomenal. And we have a couple of individuals asking. So Carrie's wondering, what brand is the rolling pin with the colored circles?
This one's called Joseph. I think that I'm not sure, am I allowed to say where I got it? I got it at Bed Bath & Beyond.
Awesome. And it definitely, as Maxine has shared, that it can make a great Christmas gift.
Good stocking stuffer.
Yeah, and it's almost like a hint, right? Like the next time you're over, maybe do something.
That's right.
Wonderful. So guys, we're almost at 8 o'clock. If there's no more questions, I just really want to thank you for everybody for joining. I want to thank Chef Laura for sharing her wonderful wisdom and her expertise and her knowledge as it comes to baking. I certainly learned so much. I hope you guys did too. Just so you know, we plan on doing more of programs on a virtual platform like this. So if you enjoyed it, please keep an eye out on the town's website, on the library's website, of all the cool activities and features that we are planning on launching. As we mentioned, Cooking with Rescued Food is one of the things that we're going to be doing virtually online every month. And I want to give Chef Laura the last word before we wrap it up.
I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining. It's nice that we can all come together and learn a few things. Happy baking, and I'm just really happy to be here, and I'm glad you came.
All right, thank you everybody. Thanks, Chef Laura. We'll see you guys very soon, hopefully in our next episode of live Q&A with Chef Laura. Take care, guys.